For this presentation, I'm going to be discussing Understanding by Design, otherwise known as UBD or Backward Design. Backward design is unique in that it really is the backwards of how we have traditionally designed curriculum. Rather than starting with how we're going to teach something, so our lesson plans, we're starting with what the desired results are, then determining how we will assess those desired results, and then finally, in the last step, we plan our learning experiences and our instruction. What we normally would do is say, okay, today I'm going to teach such and such, and I'm going to teach it by lecturing, and then in a couple weeks I'm going to do some kind of an assessment. In this case, we identify what we want our students to learn, then we determine how we're going to assess that. Are we going to do an exam? Are we going to do a paper, a discussion? And then we figure out how we're going to have them learn that material. There are 7 basic tenets to the UBD framework. The first one is that learning is enhanced when teachers purposefully think about how they're going to plan their curriculum. And the reason we use a UBD framework is because that's actually going to help us do that without having us stuck in a rigid box lockstep. The second key tenet helps us focus our curriculum and teaching on the actual development and deepening of student understanding rather than just regurgitation. So I love the idea that we're including the word deepening here. The third tenet is that understanding is revealed when students are able to independently and autonomously make sense of what they've learned and actually transfer that information into their deep-seated knowledge. The fourth tenet is that effective curriculum is planned backwards using the 3-stage design, which are desired results, evidence, and learning plan. The fifth tenet is that teachers are coaches of understanding. So we are not depositing information into our students' brain, rather we are coaching them in how to learn. Tenet number 6 is that we regularly review our curriculum, and 7 is that we continue to improve our curriculum. Stage 1 is where we identify the desired results. So in this, we are figuring out what we want our students to be able to do. And I love this little diagram over here because it really makes us think about how well we want our students to know information. Some of it we want them to understand for the rest of their life. This is key knowledge. And then some of it we want them to be able to know and do it. And then some of it we want it to like ring a bell if someone mentions it. But the way that we're going to evaluate and teach the material really depends on how well we want our students to know it. And this is really important. We have to have well-developed and written outcomes to be able to move on to the next stage. Here's where backward design really differs from traditional curricular design. Here we start to think as assessors rather than as teachers. So rather than designing our lesson plan and then trying to figure out how we're going to assess it, we determine how we're going to assess the knowledge and then design our lesson plans to accomplish those assessments. So this is really kind of an interesting flip around, and to be honest, it's taken me a little while to wrap my mind around this. I've sort of had to read this material a few times because I really want to focus on what we're teaching, not how we're assessing it. But if you think about it, by deciding how we're going to assess it first, we're actually focusing on those outcomes, not teaching style. According to UBD, there are 6 facets of understanding. And to be very honest, these remind me a lot of Bloom's taxonomy. And one of the papers I read about UBD actually discusses how it relates to Bloom's taxonomy. And the author of UBD, or one of the authors, really doesn't see an alignment between the two of them, but I still do. I mean, the key terms are there. So the 6 facets of understanding according to UBD are to explain, to interpret, to apply, to have perspective, to empathize, and to have self-knowledge. And really, these ring true for me about Bloom's taxonomy, though they've narrowed the list down to only 6, which is kind of nice. It's a little less overwhelming. But what's great about this is it guides how we're going to do our assessments. We're not just looking for regurgitation, we're looking for them to empathize, and we're looking for them to have self-knowledge, not just be able to throw terms back at us. Stage 3 is what we are used to thinking about. This is how we're used to teaching. We come up with our lesson plan, we come up with how we're going to teach the material, and then we go and teach it. But in this case, we are stepping back and we're looking at our outcomes. Then we are looking at our evidence, so how we are assessing our students of their knowledge. And then we are designing our lesson plan. And if you think about it, that actually makes a lot of sense, even though it is counterintuitive to many of us teachers. It makes sense because how can you prepare someone for an assessment that you've never seen before? I don't like the NCLEX, I'm going to say that up front, but if you think about it, if you know nothing about the NCLEX, how can you prepare students to take that NCLEX? That being said, the NCLEX is not really the kind of outcomes I want to have for a nursing program, though it is a necessary evil. So in lesson planning, or plan your learning experiences, I love that phrase, learning experiences. We're talking about, are we doing lecture? Are we doing case studies? Are we doing discussions? Is it lab? Is it hands-on? Is it clinical? All of those sorts of experiences. And remember, your lesson needs to line up to your assessments, which line up to your desired outcomes. So if I'm going to give students a practicum, I need to prepare them in a hands-on type of lesson. I can't hand them a piece, well, I could, but I shouldn't hand them a written outline, for instance, of how to put a Foley in, and then expect them in their assessment to actually go ahead and put a Foley into a mannequin. I need to incorporate the work with the mannequin into my lesson planning so that they are able to succeed on the assessment and therefore meet my learning outcomes of being able to place a Foley. So this is a very brief overview of UBD, or backward designing, and it is really an elegant way to design a curriculum without falling into kind of a lockstep pattern. So remember, what we're going to do is determine what we want our students to get out of our class. What is the takeaway message that we want them to have? Then we are going to figure out how we're going to assess their understanding and learning. And then based on those 2 steps, we are then going to plan their learning experiences and their instruction.